Okay, in this tutorial we're going to take a look at the Pathfinder Palette. Pathfinder Palette is something that I didn't know about up front, but as I found out about it, started using it, it was so helpful. So again, it's one of those things that can be kind of confusing at first, but stick with it, play with it, and understand it. I don't use everything in it all the time, but some of the time. The two I use the most are the add and subtract. Now let's figure out how this works. On the first row, I have the finished product of what the Pathfinder palette can do. On the second row, I'm going to show you how it works. The way it works is we first need to access our Pathfinder palette. Now if you haven't already done so, our Pathfinder palette is found over on the right hand side if we've put it there under Pathfinder, and if you need to find it, if you can't see it, go to Window and then click on Pathfinder. Now the way the Pathfinder works is it can help two objects interact with one another. For example, in the first column I have add. This add takes two objects and it makes the two objects one object. So at this point, this square and circle have now become one object. Now I'll show you how to do this. If I select the square and the circle here, and I come over to my shape modes and click on add to shape area, it now adds those two shapes together. Now the object will take on the characteristics of the topmost object. So in this case, the blue was eliminated and they became both kind of that charcoal color. Now that they are one object, I still have the ability to edit them at this point. If I come to them and I double click within the two objects, I now can move these two independently of one another. But when I come back, they are still one object. Now let's say I didn't ever want to make a change to these. I don't ever want to have the ability to double click on them, select a particular object and move it. Let's say I never wanted to do that. What you can do is over in your Pathfinder option, you have an expand button. If you expand compound shape, that's what you're doing in the Pathfinder. You're creating compound shapes. You're taking two shapes, making them one, or subtracting or whatever. Let's say you want them to be the final result and not have editing capabilities. And for whatever purpose, one may work and one may not, depending on your needs. I'm going to go ahead and click expand. Now see what happens to all of our anchor points. Now we don't have the ability. If I double click on this guy, it does nothing. These are now one shape. It is completely 100% one shape, and I can't do any type of edits. I can't move that circle or square independently of each other anymore. Let's go to the next one, subtract. As you can see on the upper row, you can see what's going to happen when I do this. I'm going to select both objects, come over to my shape modes, hit subtract from shape area, and they now have done that. But let's say I wanted to move the circle up a little bit. If I double click, I'm now inside the compound shape. If I move it and then click off, you now can see that the circle has now been moved. Let's undo that. But I want this to be right there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click expand. And now this is one shape. I cannot move or edit that circle or square independently of one another. It is now one consistent shape. Now let's try intersect. I'm going to go ahead and select on these two. Going to click intersect shape area. And where those two objects intersect is where the shape will be formed. Again, I can double click on these two and I can move the circle a little bit. Let's go ahead and move it up here. Double click off. Now you can see the shape has changed a little bit. I can go ahead and expand this if I wanted. I'm going to go ahead and undo it so that it's back to where it was initially. Click on expand. Now it is this one shape. I don't have the square or the circle anymore to edit independently of one another. Now let's go and do the exclude. Same thing. Click exclude. I can come over, I can double click, and I can move the compound shape a little bit. And it does a little flip-flop. Wherever they cross, it eliminates, and wherever they don't, it creates. I haven't used this one that much. Play around with it. It's pretty cool if you're trying to do some cool looks, but don't use that one too terribly often. Now, let's go ahead and let's look at our Pathfinder options. We've been messing with the shape modes. We also have a Pathfinder option. Now, I don't use the Pathfinder options hardly ever, so please bear with me if I embarrass myself because I don't understand them as much. I just don't use them as much. The shape modes I use constantly, especially the add and subtract option. So I've got them here, and I've got the final product of what they do up above. Now if I double click on this guy, you can see that it has now created a group, and each of these move independently of one another. Okay, so we can begin to play with these. Let's see how it works. Okay, so I'm going to select this object, going to come over here, and I'm going to click the divide button, and this takes everywhere that they've intersect and it creates a new shape. It puts them into a group, so you'll either need to ungroup them or double click on them to enter into the group, and then from there you can begin to manipulate them independently. So you can see where those have intersected, it's created a different shape. Let's try the trim. Come over here to my Pathfinder, click trim, come over here, I'm going to double click to enter to edit within the group, and as you can see, it's trimmed the two. It didn't create three shapes, but where they intersected, it's deleted out of the square and it's left our circle intact. Let's do the merge. Come over here, click merge, and let's go ahead and double click on them. And the same kind of thing, it merges the two together. Same type of deal as the trim. If you had multiple objects here, it would interact a little bit different. The crop option, as you can see, let's come over here and click crop. It takes the two objects. If I double click on them, and where the two intersect, it will crop them and make two objects. Okay. The outline option here creates an outline of the objects. If I double click on them, I can move them independently of one another. It's created these outline shapes that I now can move separately of one another. Let me see if I can select this. It's so fine. As you can see, they're all different shapes. And finally, the minus back. Let's go ahead and click on that. It just left, it's deleted everything. It's almost like the subtract tool, except it's almost counterintuitive of the shape mode. So instead of deleting whatever the part that's on top, deleting what's below, it does it opposite of that. So as you can see, it's made us kind of this little Pac-Man mouth shape. So play with the Pathfinder palette. It's extremely helpful. I especially use the shape modes a lot. And you can see how having two objects interact with one another and creating compound objects or using the Pathfinders, you can begin to create some cool shapes. For example, if I click on this shape here, this is beginning to look like a baseball diamond, but I didn't even have to trace that out. By having two shapes interact with one another, I was able to create something that looked kind of like a baseball diamond. So that's kind of the way you have to think within Illustrator. Think very simplistic. Take simple shapes and have them interact with one another to finally create a shape that works for you. So play around with it. It's kind of tricky at first, but it is a tool that you will use an awful lot.